But think about this particular individual who was making $30, $40 or $40, $50 at the factory, lost a job, now has to work in a ballpark selling hot dogs and now at minimum wage, right? Hearing in the news largely as the curve kind of tends to flatten. Countries across the world are starting to think about back to normalcy, right? Opening up economy and things like that. But however, this pandemic has changed a lot of stuff, especially the changes to supply chain is quite dramatic, right? So that brings me the question, is this the time to rethink globalization? Is it now too risky to look at the merits of globalization, and is it time to start thinking about going local, start manufacturing local? What are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, so I think that's a very common sentiment, especially with things like essential goods, right? Where we've seen vulnerabilities in the supply chain that lead to countries not being able to get critical PPE when they need it, including things like 3M being ordered by the U.S. president to divert shipments away from countries that have ordered the PPE already and were expecting to receive it, and then they were diverted back to the U.S. So I think this protectionism sentiment has been growing across the world, but I think let's step back and think about why do we have trade in the first place? We just don't have all the things that we need to produce everything that we need to have, right? So if you think about like just the clothes that we're wearing, we in Canada cannot produce cotton. The climate just is not able to support that. Yeah. So there's various resources that other countries cannot produce. So trade at minimum enables us to be able to get the raw materials. So that's number one. Number two is, okay, so we can think about this as kind of a comparative advantage between the different countries, right? For countries that are able to produce labor-intensive goods more effectively. Countries like China, like Vietnam, right? They can produce it more efficiently and effectively because they can pay lower wages to the workers, and they have a lot of workers. Whereas in countries like Canada and the U.S., the wages are higher, so we're not able to put bodies against the work because that would cost way too much to do. But Canada and the U.S. have innovation. They have higher skilled workers, knowledge workers who can provide higher value goods to these other countries. And so the trade is beneficial for both countries because countries like Canada and the US, we can get goods for cheaper. And then countries like China, Vietnam, they can get higher technology goods, right? More higher tech goods than they otherwise could have. So this is the case for like the comparative advantage for trading.
Yeah, which makes sense, right? So if the US is good at making airplanes and let's say Vietnam is good at making shoes, then the US could exchange airplanes for shoes. I'm just oversimplifying it, but they're both better off where Americans get shoes for cheap and people in Vietnam get now aircrafts, right?
Yep, that's right.
So it makes sense. We are missing one thing, especially that's been magnified during this crisis, is that all those fault lines, the serious fault lines with supply chain have been exposed, especially from a geopolitical standpoint, right? There's a lot of uncertainties within certain governments like China, where you don't have much transparency into the institutions, and it just got magnified now, and it was always there, but now just got way more magnified, and the allegations of IP theft and things like that. Now I can make the argument that the risk with relying on such global powers where there's very little transparency is much more greater than us being self-sufficient and start manufacturing, right? I'm not saying that we have to like manufacture everything, but we do have capacity to manufacture certain things. Instead of outsourcing every single part of a car to other countries, we can start manufacturing something here, or we can repurpose those closed out factories. For example, GM closed out in Oshawa. It's not just a GM plant that closed off, but also OEM plants are also now out of business. So we still have that capital, that additional capacity to leverage. So it's a matter of how we can mobilize our workforce to repivot to other goods and services, right? So that way we can kind of hedge our risks and not rely on these other global powers.
Yeah, so that's a good thought. If we break down what has to happen, right, I think there needs to be some kind of focused investment from the government to say, we're going to put focused effort behind repurposing these plants to produce other goods, which means what you're doing in effect there is governments will actually have to subsidize those plant transformations in order to make that happen. And what that's going to cause is it's going to cause other countries to react. So we can think of this as kind of like the prisoner's dilemma, right? So countries can choose to either cooperate with each other, have free trade with each other, or to defect, like to do something that will benefit that country in the short term at the expense of the other country, right? So the optimal strategy for both countries is to cooperate with each other, leverage each other's comparative advantages, and have a healthy trading relationship. But the dominant strategy is to defect, because what happens is I'm going to have a gain at your expense, right? And then I'm afraid of you doing the same thing against me. So I'm going to just every single time I would want to defect and look after my own interests. That results in a worse outcome for both of us collectively. Why does this happen sometimes, right? We look at things like the U.S. Donald Trump putting in all of these trade tariffs, right? That's a form of defection. It's because political incentives are not necessarily aligned with longer term national incentives. If we think about democratic countries, there's term limits, or there's at least time limit on each term. So the incentive is really to think about, will I win, or will my party win that next election, rather than the best strategy for the long term for my country.
Yeah, that's a good point. I tend to agree that again, trade is collectively good, and NAFTA has been so successful since the 90s. It changed. There was so much economic growth across America, across all the three countries, right? Since the 90s, great things happened. But what economists missed is the impact to a human impact. So let me go a little bit deeper on that. So let's say all these people working in steel factories in the Rust Belt, when these factories closed down and moved overseas, they lost their job. These are people who made $40, $50 an hour, right? NAFTA came in, everyone is well off. There's more disposable income into the economy because like goods are cheaper, you have more savings, and that savings you again spend it in the economy. You go to the ballpark, you go movies and things like that, everybody prospers. But think about this particular individual who was making $30, $40 or $40, $50 at the factory, lost their job, now has to work in a ballpark selling hot dogs and now at minimum wage, right? So they don't necessarily equate to each other. So there's so much benefits on an aggregate level that trade has brought in. The individual level, people have fallen through the cracks, and sometimes it is the job of the government through social safety net programs and things like that to make sure these people are not falling off the cracks, right? And that resentment from these people is what I would say is also feeding to populism and this growth of nationalization, right?
Yeah, for sure. So I think you're definitely right. This is something that economists miss, right? Like in looking at the big picture, you miss the impact on individuals. So yeah, so government definitely has a role to play for these individuals who are displaced in their employment, right? Basically, they're losing their jobs and they need help to transition to a new job. Let's think about this as kind of technological progression perspective, right? So if we think back on kind of the bigger movements, right, where you go from the steam engine to electrification, go from that to assembly lines to now we're going into software development. Those are not the same skill sets. So the people who are impacted, they can't get a job in that next level of technology. When people can't get the job in the next level of technology, what happened in the past was that people moved to where the jobs were, right? So even within a country, you have comparative advantage between states, between provinces, and that you can trade between states and between provinces. So you go to where the jobs were that you could do within your country and continue to find a new job. But what happened over the last number of decades is we've put in place a lot of these social welfare policies and a lot of these policies that encourage home ownership, right? That prevent people from moving, don't give good incentives for people to move to where the jobs are. So what happens is you've lost that dynamism in the economy where people are going to different places to do their jobs or trying to just find whatever job that they can in order to continue to provide for their families. Now, this is not necessarily a good or bad thing that this has happened. I think that there's pros and cons to policies that we put in place over the last few decades, namely we're no longer seeing people having to move and then families being torn apart, right? We're not seeing people move into the city and having to live in high density bunk beds, right, with other workers, right? Like we're not seeing those things anymore. So those are definitely positives. The cost is we lose that dynamism in the economy that allows the economy to respond quicker.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, we are not seeing those things, at least in the US, right? It might be still going on in other parts of the world, but not in the US, right? Yeah, that was great. Certainly, there are changes happening with the globalization, with supply changes. But there's no denying the fact there's growing interest, growing support for protectionism and nationalism. And sometimes it might be a good thing, sometimes it might be a bad thing. If you want to look at history, we can look back during World War days when US got into World War II. There was a massive push for manufacturing to produce all the tanks, guns, jeeps, and then there was massive involvement of women into the workforce, which kind of propelled the U.S. victory or U.S. momentum into the World War II and ultimately the Allies winning it, right? We don't know how it's going to end up. It's quite evident that there's some support for protectionism and nationalism going forward, at least.
Your World War II analogy was a good one. The analogy to today is really where's the investment in digital infrastructure? Where's the investment in getting people skilled up so that they can get to that next level of technological progression and ability so that they can actually take on those higher value jobs?